last several weeks, we have been in a series of studies in the book of Ecclesiastes. We began a few weeks back by introducing Ecclesiastes, spending a lesson on the background, who the writer is, the message of the book, and the purpose for which the book was written. We then have been surveying a couple of chapters at a time. So we covered 1 and 2 together, 3 and 4, and then 2 weeks ago was the last time we were in Ecclesiastes. We covered chapters 5 and chapter 6. Then last week, I was out of town, so we had the singing. And then tonight, we are resuming our study by looking at Ecclesiastes chapters 7 and 8. And so, turn to Ecclesiastes 7 and 8 if you haven't already. That's where we're going to be spending our time tonight. And so I encourage you to follow with me in our study of Ecclesiastes 7 and 8. As we have been mentioning in our study of Ecclesiastes, and something we want to remind ourselves of, is that the book divides itself down into really 4 sections. And we've called these 4 sections, we're using an outline Brother Waldron used, similar to that Kaiser used, in which they divided it down by 4 discourses. The discourse 1 is chapter 1, verse 2, verse 1 being an introduction, chapter 1, verse 2 through the end of chapter 2. Then our second discourse was chapter 3, 4, and 5, and then the third one is chapter 6 through the majority of chapter 8. There's 2 verses left when we end the discourse as is divided down by Kaiser and Brother Waldron. And then our final discourse will cover chapter 8, verse 16 through the end of the book. We will be in part in these final 2 discourses tonight. 2 weeks ago, we finished discourse 2 when we studied chapter 5, and then beginning chapter 6, we covered the first part of discourse 4, or 3 rather. We're going to finish that with chapter 7 and chapter 8, and we'll get the first 2 verses of discourse 4 in verses 16 and 17 here of chapter 8 this evening. But again, we're going to begin by finishing up and focusing on the end of discourse 3 for most of our time tonight. Now, as we begin in Ecclesiastes 7 and 8, Ecclesiastes 7, I would simply title, The Value and Limits of Wisdom. Both of these chapters deal in great detail with wisdom. And so as both of them are dealing with wisdom, this chapter focuses in the first half on its value, and then in 15 to 22, some things that wisdom teaches us. But in what it teaches us, it really is telling us what the limits of wisdom are. The key verse, I think, is verse 11, and I don't know why it's running off the screen. Give me just a minute. Something is off here. Let me switch it over, and I think I can get this back on screen. Here we go. Verse 11 of chapter 7 is our key verse. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. I think that's a summary there of this, as the first 14 verses are our first section. As we talk about Ecclesiastes 7 and the value and limits of wisdom, this passage begins with the value of wisdom. And that's the passage Bonnie read for us a moment ago, beginning at verse 1 and going through verse 14. In this section on the value of wisdom, there are 3 subsections. The first of those is wisdom improves our life by allowing us to see the value in suffering in 1 to 10. 11 and 12 shows that the value of wisdom and that wisdom can be a defense. And in 13 and 14, wisdom is valuable because it teaches us to accept God's providence. But let's begin with that first subsection. It improves our life and allows us by allowing us to see value in suffering. In 1 to 10 it says, a good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of one's birth. Better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, For this is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by a sad countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. It is better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For like the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. Surely oppression destroys a wise man's reason, and a bribe debases the heart. The end of a thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. Now Solomon begins in verse 1. He says, a good name is better than precious ointment. And if you think about the idea of the good name being better than precious ointment, the idea is even if there's this ointment or something that is of great material value to you, having a good reputation is better than, or a good name and a reputation is better than having that precious ointment. Somebody may see value in terms of the monetary value of that precious ointment, but better is a good name. He then says the day of death is better than the day of one's birth, and better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Now, if we take a step back for just a minute and evaluate that at face value, and that is, just look at it from the earthly standpoint, that does not make sense. When somebody is born, you have people calling and sending congratulations. You have, to the parents, you have people there. There's excitement. There's tears of joy. And yet you flip to the other side, the house of mourning or a funeral home. You don't walk in and see people laughing and patting each other on the back and telling each other congratulations, because that's a time of seriousness, a time of mourning. Yet the second one, the house of mourning, is better than the house of feasting. Look at verse 4. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, and the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. And then verse 2, for this is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. The reality is that life is temporary. And someday, and we've talked about this some already in Ecclesiastes, someday we're going to give an account for how we've lived. If this life was all there is, then just focus on the here and the now. In fact, we've been saying throughout Ecclesiastes that Solomon's point in Ecclesiastes is that he's trying to find what makes his life complete or whole. Here's a man who had a void in his life, and he wanted to know what would fill it. His conclusion was that doing the things that from the earthly standpoint are meant to bring joy did not bring him fulfillment. You can go back to chapter 2 as we refer to it as the trying of the 5 W's. We call that chapter the vanity of the 5 W's, where Solomon says, I tried wisdom or pleasure. He says pleasure and or wine rather. Pleasure. He says both terms. We say wine because it makes it easier to remember. That he tried wine or pleasure. He tried wisdom of the earthly kind. He tried women. He tried wealth. He tried work. And listen to Solomon's conclusion again from chapter 2. Then I looked on all the works that my hands had done and the labor in which I had toiled, and indeed all was vanity and grasping for the wind. Solomon's already tried to fill his life with focus on the here and the now, and Solomon has found that's not what life's about. And so when you come into chapters 3 and 4, we've seen him make some reference to the fact that we're going to give an account. Over I saw under the sun, verse 16 of chapter 3, in the place of judgment wickedness was there, and in the place of righteousness iniquity was there. I said in my heart, verse 17, God shall judge righteousness, the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time there for every purpose and for every work. Solomon, though he's focused on life, as we've said, under the sun, has made mention of eternity in this book and says, listen, there's eternity and we got to give an account for how we've lived. So chapter 7, It's better to go to the house of mourning because it makes you contemplate your end. This is the end of all men. The Hebrew writer, in making a point about the fact that Christ had to suffer just once, not time and time again, but just once for the sins of mankind, paralleled it to our death, in which he said, it is appointed to man once to die, and after this the judgment, Hebrews 9, and in verse 27. David, in 1 Kings chapter 2, in addressing Solomon, and Joshua in chapter 23, in addressing the people of Israel, both said they were about to go the way of all the earth. That is the end of all, and so better to go to the house of mourning because it causes one to contemplate. The house of the wise is, or the heart of the wise, verse 4, is in the house of mourning, and the heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. So when you take about wisdom, from an earthly standpoint, it makes more sense with that. If you don't have wisdom, it's better to go to the house of, not to go to the house of mourning, but to the house of feasting. It's better to be born than to die. Solomon says it's really the opposite when we look at things from the standpoint of wisdom. Verse 5 now, it's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the songs of fools. You don't want somebody that's simply going to tell you you're okay. In fact, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, the Apostle Paul told the young preacher Timothy to preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. And the reason was that their time was coming when some would not endure sound doctrine, but instead with itching ears would heap up for themselves teachers. Somebody wants to stay in the life they're in, they can find somebody that'll tell them they're okay even if they're insane. But rebuke by a wise man, that's better than the songs of fools. I think that's the idea there. It's better than the songs of praise that come from fools. In fact, he says, the crackling of for like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. I think the point is, the laughter is empty. There's really nothing behind it. Like the rebuke of the fool, or the rebuke of the wise, carries wisdom with it, but the fool's laughter and his commendation does not really mean anything. That's why, as we've seen, going back to verse 8 now, as he ties this together, the end of the thing is better than its beginning. The patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Do not hasten in your spirit to be angry, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. Again, when you're using wisdom, realize the end is better than the beginning. I think going back to the point of verses 1 through 4. And then not to hasten in anger, for anger rests in the bosom of fools. You want to be a wise person. A wise person is not one that, as they say, just sort of flies off the handle. Do not say, why were the former days better than these? For you do not inquire wisely concerning this. I think as you take that section of a whole, imagine for a minute, you're standing there at the house of mourning, and you're wondering, why is this day not as good as before when I was able to be at the house of feasting? Here you're standing, and the wise are rebuking you, and that doesn't seem very joyful in the moment. Why is this not as good as the days before when I was getting patted on the back and praised by those that Solomon called fools? And the reason is that he says, you do not inquire wisely concerning this. That is your view of understanding that suffering is okay. To understand and improve your life by understanding you can make it through suffering, by understanding that there's lessons to be learned in that, is something that comes with wisdom. Here's the second thing he says about the value of wisdom, verse 11 and 12. Wisdom is good with an inheritance and profitable to those who see the sun. For wisdom is a defense, as money is a defense. But the excellence of knowledge is that wisdom gives life to those who have it. Wisdom is a defense. Now, how's wisdom a defense? Well, wisdom's a defense because it helps you in how to handle different situations. I think about James chapter 1, and we'll come back to this later when we talk about some practical application. But in James 1, where James told the people there that if anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach. Then he talks about asking without doubting, and if you doubt, you're the one that's tossed about. But you know what he says leading up to that discussion on wisdom and prayer? He said in verse 2 of chapter 1, "Count it all joy, my brethren, when you endure various trials." And then verse 5 is talking about having wisdom, I think in two standpoints. Wisdom to make it through the trials, but also wisdom to see the benefits of those trials. You know what that wisdom is in that moment, though, when you face the trial? Wisdom's a defense. What about temptation? Wisdom's a defense. Wisdom's a defense, just how people want to use money as a defense. You got a problem, throw some money at it, maybe it'll fix it. Wisdom truly is a defense. Wisdom's good with an inheritance, as it says in verse 11. Verse 13 and 14 now, wisdom accepts God's providence. Consider the work of God, for who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful, but in the day of adversity consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other, so that man can find out nothing that will come after him. We've talked about this already. God has providential control. Regardless of what man tries to do, God will fulfill his plan. Man has tried to thwart God's plan, and in the end actually has helped in the carrying of that out, in the case of men like Herod and Pilate, who put Christ to death. The reality is, we don't know what God has planned. And so, consider the work of God, what he's made straight, or we can't make straight what he made crooked. And I think what comes to my mind is about in Isaiah when it talks about those, when it came to sin, that tried to call sin something other than sin. And that happens in society today. But in verse 14, I think in particular, it shows us that these two verses are dealing with the fact that God has providential control, and what he's going to do, we can't change. But in the day of adversity, consider, surely God has appointed the one as well as the other. That is, God has providential control in some plan. We don't know what that is, as we saw in chapter 3. But wisdom says, I need to accept the fact that God is the one in control. Think about those, as we've been studying in Revelation, and their suffering, to realize God is the one in control is what they need to hear. Go to the second section now, verse 15 to 22. Wisdom teaches us. There's some things that wisdom teaches us. Wisdom teaches us, first and foremost, to avoid extremes. I've seen everything in my days of vanity. There is a just man who perishes in his righteousness, and there's a wicked man who prolongs his life in wickedness. Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you grasp this, and also not remove your hand from the other, for he who fears God will escape them all. To begin in verse 15, that sometimes you look at it, and there's a just man who perishes in his righteousness. That doesn't seem fair. There's a wicked man who lives wickedly, and by it prolongs his days. Solomon said, that doesn't seem fair. What ends up happening then is some try to go to an extreme. Verse 16, do not be overly righteous. Verse 17, do not be overly wicked. Now, he's not saying that we're not to be righteous individuals, or there's a point where we can become too righteous. I'll share a quote with you from Brother Waldron in a minute concerning that. But get the picture here. The bigger picture is people are trying to go to the extremes, and wisdom is helping keep that in check. That you're not trying to be so extreme one way or the other. Now, of this text, again, as I mentioned, Brother Waldron, Brother Waldron wrote material, a lot of material. It's his outline, the discourses we're following. And he said this verse, Solomon is not saying that one can be too righteous in the sense of pleasing God and actually doing his will. He's referring to the effort some make to go beyond what is required. They invent their own rules for obtaining holiness and righteousness. They become guilty of will worship and appoint all sorts of ordinances which make quite an impression on their observers, but which have little value in guarding against the indulgence of the flesh. I think that's a good summary there. That is, maybe you've got somebody over here that they say, I want to be righteous and serve God. So they try to be so extreme. They start making up their own rules to be so strict. Sounds like some people in the New Testament. It sounds like the Pharisees who took what the elders, what their forefathers had taught, and they took and taught that as doctrine and tried to bind where God had not bound. They had tried to be overly righteous. And we know they weren't really righteous in the eyes of God, but they had tried to be overly righteous by binding where God had not bound. And so when you take 16 and 17, not to be overly righteous. Don't try to do something to make yourself seem righteous over others. Do not, on the other hand, be so extreme that you're overly wicked. But the point is, make sure you're focused on your service to God. He who fears God, a true fear of God. What does a true fear of God do? Fear God and keep His commandments. That's the conclusion we're going to get to in chapter 12 when we finish this book in a couple of weeks. Fear God. He who fears God will escape them all. Fear of God will cause us to escape these problems. Verse 19 then tells us that wisdom teaches us so that we can become strengthened. Wisdom strengthens the wise more than 10 rulers of the city. Wisdom's that defense earlier. Wisdom provides strength. Though it may not provide physical strength, in some ways it can, but though it does not provide physical strength, wisdom provides spiritual strength to remain strong in service to God. Then that should be, point C, should be 20 through 22, the rest of this section, that no man is perfect. For there is not a just man on earth who does good and does not sin. Also do not take to heart what people are saying, lest you hear your you. For many times also your own heart has known that even you have cursed others. You know, there's nobody just. There's not a just man who just never sins, he says in verse 20. In fact, when somebody says something against you, verse 21, don't take it to heart, but consider maybe you said something about them, verse 21. Verse 23 now, through the end of the chapter, is about the attaining of wisdom. All that I have proved by wisdom, I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. As for that which is far off and exceedingly deep, who can find it? I applied my heart to know, to search and seek out wisdom, and the reason of things, to know the wickedness of folly, even of foolishness and madness. Solomon said, I went to seek wisdom, and guess what I found? Wisdom, verse 23, is far from me. Verse 24, it is far off, and it is exceedingly deep. Wisdom's not something you're going to come upon by accident. It takes diligence to seek wisdom. Solomon says, I sought out wisdom, and he found wisdom. And here's what he learned while seeking wisdom. Verse 26, I find more bitter than death, the woman whose heart is snares and nets, whose hands are fetters. He who puts on shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be trapped by her. Falling into the hands of a wicked woman, he says, verse 26, is worse than death. If anybody knew that, that'd be Solomon. Verse 28 now, or 27 now. Here's what I have found, said the preacher. Adding one thing to another to find out the reason, which my soul still seeks, but I cannot find it. One man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. Truly this only I have found, that God made me upright, but those who have sought out many schemes. So Solomon then says, a good man's hard to find, and a good woman even rarer to find. And commentators are divided on what exactly Solomon means. And so let's start with what I don't think Solomon means. I don't think Solomon is putting down women. Okay, that would contradict some other things Solomon said. But I want you to notice the number he says in verse 28. Man among 1,000 I have found, but a woman among all these I have not found. I think Solomon's talking about his wives. Solomon's talking about his wives. All the women of the world he married, and he says, you know what? They weren't wise. It was hard to find a wise man, even harder for him to find a wise woman. Verse 28. Truly this only I found, that God made me upright, but they have sought out many schemes. That is, mankind has sought out many schemes, despite how God made man. Let's go to chapter 8 now. Chapter 8 I simply title Wisdom and Practice. There are two sections to this chapter. There's wisdom when it comes to our relation to the government, and wisdom when it comes to facing oppression and injustice. The key verse is verse 1. Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. Let's focus on 1 to 10 now. Who is like a wise man, and who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face, and the sternness of his face is changed. I say keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power, and who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, but a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. Because for every matter there is a time and judgment, though the misery of a man increases greatly. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? No one has the power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has the power in the day of death. There is no release from that war, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. So let's get an overview here. The point of first 8 verses is verse 2, keep the king's command. This passage is making the same point that Paul is making in Romans chapter 13, in verse 9 through verse 7, about submitting to the government. Obey the king. Now what he says in verse 3 is, do not be hasty to go out from his presence, and do not take your stand for an evil thing. What he's saying in verse 3 is, do not try to bring about rebellion against the king. You obey the king, don't bring about rebellion against him. Now part of the problem that man faces is when rulers are wicked, and we're going to get to those more in 9 to 13 in a minute. But I think he starts introducing the idea by saying, for every matter there's a time, or verse 5, he who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, but a wise man's heart discerns time and judgment. Because for every matter there's a time and judgment, though the misery of man increases greatly. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? I think, again, 9 and 10 are going to deal with this in more detail. But there seems to be this idea by some that the rulers aren't suffering for being the way they are, or they do whatever they want, and there's no consequences. And so why not rebel against them? Why not maybe become our own rulers? And Solomon said to submit to them. Verse 9 to 10 then expands on that problem, I think, that's introduced in verse 5 and 6 through verse 8. It says, all this I have seen and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city, where they had so done. This also is vanity. So there are wicked rulers who pretend to be righteous men. And I think, again, that idea is introduced in verses 6 through 8. But in verse 9, there's a time in which one man rules over another, but he does so to his own hurt. That is, one man's the ruler, and he's trying to hurt the people under him. Well, what comes about? The wicked are buried, and then they are forgotten. And so there's wicked rulers who pretend to be righteous, but eventually they're going to cease to be rulers. Now verse 11 through 13, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the heart of the sons of man is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner does evil times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Now, you've probably heard that verse a number of times. You probably quoted that verse to somebody when, in discussion, the fact that we live in a wicked world, and it seems that mankind's not being punished for that. Not yet. And so somebody may go then and say, well, though a sinner does, verse 11, the sentence is not done speedily, and so people just try to stay in sin. I don't think that's a misuse of Ecclesiastes 8, 11 through 13. But here's the point I want us to get from this. The point that he's making is about their rulers. Remember verse 9? They're over you to your hurt. Verse 10, 11, because the sentence is not done quickly, people just set themselves to do evil. Think about, in preparation for Ecclesiastes, what came to my mind is what we've been studying in our Bible study on Sunday morning and Wednesday night. Here's Domitian as the ruler of Rome, oppressing the people that are trying to serve God. And some are compromising and giving in. Because why not? It's not that big a deal. It's allegiance to Rome. As we've said, some may try to convince themselves. But ultimately, the point is made, and we'll get to this, Lord willing, on Wednesday in chapter 14, that those that worship the beast, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever. That is, eventually, there's going to be consequences. And think about Domitian. And if you were able to ask Domitian today, would you go back? Change the way that you do. Would you go back and obey the gospel? You can ask anyone that's lived who did not serve God. I think the answer would be yes. Just look at the story of the rich man in Luke chapter 16, who wanted Lazarus to go back to teach his family. And so, because judgment's not done, people think, well, it's not that big a deal. But the point is, it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days. Even if it goes well on the earth, there's eventually going to be judgment, and man will give an account for how he's lived. 2 Corinthians 5 and in verse 10. We must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account for the things done in the body, whether good or evil. One more section here, and then we'll talk about some practical lessons in Ecclesiastes chapters 7 and 8. The section I'll title Wisdom for Dealing with Injustice. Verse 14, it can happen to those that are righteous according to those who are wicked. There's a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I say this also. There's vanity. You take the picture, if you step back from Solomon's standpoint, and Solomon says, here's a man trying to serve God, and he's suffering. Here's a man in direct opposition to God, and he seems to be thriving. Seems like an injustice. So, verse 15, I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and drink and be merry, in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun. Solomon says now in verse 15 is you need to learn to enjoy life. But again, a reminder to us, as Solomon is reminding us, each of these discourses has been showing, and you can go back for all the verses back on our introduction lesson and download that from that material from the website, that we said that each section, we gave those verses then, each discourse ends with the difference God makes. Look again at verse 15. Again at verse 15. So I commended enjoyment, because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat and drink and be merry, for this will remain with him all the days of his life, which God gives him. Life itself. Not just the enjoyment of life. We've already seen in chapter 2. We've seen in chapter 5. Enjoying life is a gift from God. Life itself, verse 15, is a gift from God. God gives us our days under the sun. Finally, 16 and 17, man cannot understand all that God has planned. Think again, going back to the point that chapter 3 made, chapter 7 made. God has providential control, and we do not know what his plans are. But we need to trust him. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day and night, then I saw the work of God, that a man he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. Man's not going to understand all that God has planned, and so don't concern yourself with trying to figure out God's plan. You're not going to know exactly what God's plan in terms of his providential plan is. But trust in God. Let's talk about some practical lessons. Again, we've been saying in this, we do this in a lot of our textual studies, but we're in an Old Testament passage. How do I take that in Ecclesiastes and make application today? Well, number one, we need wisdom because it helps us see the good in our suffering. Again, I think that's the point of 1 to 10. About going to the house of mourning, about having the rebuke of the wise, that it is better. Again, I would parallel that to James chapter 1, verses 2 through 8. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials, knowing the testing of your produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that it may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any one of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach. Again, I think wisdom in terms of enduring trials may be partially in mind, but I think the context would indicate in James chapter 1 that the wisdom he has under consideration is not wisdom to help overcome trials, but wisdom to see there's benefit in them and how to see the benefit in them. Wisdom helps us see there can be good in suffering. Wisdom teaches us to accept God's providence, chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, as we already saw. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider. Wisdom provides strength. And again, I think in particular we're focusing, wisdom provides us spiritual strength. When we have wisdom to help us overcome the things we face. Wisdom is hard to find. And it's something that if we want it, we must seek it out. Again, there's some things that don't happen by accident. And one of the things that doesn't happen by accident is you don't accidentally find wisdom. If you want to find wisdom, you've got to seek it out. Solomon said it was hard to find. Finally, wisdom teaches us to enjoy life, 8:15, because we see that life itself is a gift from God. That as we think about all the blessings that God gives us, and we pray for those great many blessings, that the very breath in our body is a gift from God. And so wisdom teaches us that we need to enjoy life by realizing it's a gift from God. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and chapter 8. Hopefully these, again, we're running through these fairly quick, sort of just survey exactly what the content of these chapters are about, and Lord willing, we'll continue that next week as we go into chapters 9 and 10. We've got two lessons left, and then we will be done with the book of Ecclesiastes. So we'll cover 9 and 10 next week, and then we'll finish the book, Lord willing, the next week with 11 and 12. But it may be now as we come to a close this evening that there may be one or more who may have never responded in obedience to the gospel. Here, you've heard the word of God, and you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Do not repent of your sins. Confess your faith in Him. Buried in the waters of baptism. Rise and walk in the newness of life. Having your sins forgiven. Having the hope of heaven on life on earth. Maybe you're here and you've done that. As we talked about this morning, maybe somewhere along the line you've drifted away. Again, you have opportunity to return this evening. Sin of a private nature, you can thank the Lord privately in prayer. Sin of a public nature, you desire the prayers of the congregation. We'll gladly pray with you and for you for God to forgive you. No matter what your need is, if we anyway, which not for right now is together.